On October 13, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 took off on a routine journey, carrying 45 passengers, including a rugby team, their friends, and family. But what was meant to be a simple flight turned into a harrowing tale of survival when the plane crashed in the treacherous Andes Mountains. Stranded in an unforgiving landscape, facing extreme cold, dwindling supplies, and isolation, the survivors were forced to make unimaginable choices. Their fight for survival tested the limits of human endurance, camaraderie, and morality. As they battled the elements and their own desperation, would they find hope, or would the mountains claim them forever? This is a story of resilience, sacrifice, and the incredible will to live against all odds. But before we dive in, some of the details in this story are extremely disturbing and may not be suitable for all audiences, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. As always, remember to hit the like button, share the video, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to stay up to date with the channel. Alright, let's dive into the video. The plane, a Fairchild FH227D, was chartered by the club's president. It wasn't just the team on board, friends and family joined them, filling all 40 passenger seats. One passenger, Graziella Mariani, only bought her ticket at the last moment after another traveler canceled. She was eager to attend her daughter's wedding. The aircraft took off from Carrasco International Airport, heading toward the towering Andes Mountains. But storm clouds gathered ahead, forcing the pilot to make an unplanned stop in Mendoza, Argentina. The team had to wait, grounded until the weather cleared. Flying over the Andes is never simple. The mountains are massive, with some peaks reaching almost 23,000 feet. Even for skilled pilots, navigating these peaks requires precision, patience, and luck. But this plane, loaded with passengers, couldn't climb much higher than 28,000 feet, leaving little room for error. Rather than risk a direct route, the pilot opted for a safer, longer path, a 90-minute U-shaped course around the mountains, heading south before turning west toward Chile. It was the standard way for planes like theirs to cross the Andes safely. On October 13th, the weather still hadn't improved by morning. Yet by early afternoon, conditions seemed to ease. The crew decided to take their chance. At 2:18 p.m., the plane lifted off from Mendoza, climbing into the sky. They followed their planned route, flying toward the Malargue waypoint at 18,000 feet. At exactly 3:21 p.m., they radioed their position. They were approaching the Planchon Pass, a critical handoff point between Argentinian and Chilean airspace. This was the moment they were supposed to cross into Chilean skies, turn north, and begin their descent into Santiago. But what happened next remains shrouded in mystery, and marked the beginning of a nightmare no one could have imagined. Somewhere high above the Andes, everything started to go wrong. Pilot Julio Cesar Ferradas was no stranger to the Andes. He had crossed these mountains 29 times before, but this time, he wasn't alone at the controls. Ferradas was training his co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Lagurara, who was in charge for much of the flight. As the aircraft climbed higher, thick clouds rolled in, swallowing the jagged peaks below. The mountains vanished from sight, leaving the pilots to rely on their instruments alone. There was no way to confirm their location visually, just endless clouds and the invisible dangers lurking within them. The aircraft itself carried a history too. It was just 4 years old with 792 flight hours, but among pilots, it had earned an unfortunate nickname, the lead sled. They considered it underpowered, struggling to keep pace with the demands of high-altitude flights. To increase capacity, the plane's fuselage had been stretched by 6 feet, adding more seats and cargo space between the cockpit and passenger cabin. Despite these modifications, the Fairchild aircraft had a troubling record. Of the 78 models built, 23 had already been involved in accidents. This flight tragically became the 10th crash in the model's history. Flying at 18,000 feet, they aimed to pass through the Planchon Pass, just 8,251 feet above sea level. But with no visibility of the ground below, the pilots had to rely entirely on their instruments. Any misstep could leave them dangerously off course. At 3:21 p.m., the crew of the ill-fated flight radioed air traffic control. They had just crossed Planchon Pass and believed Curicó, their next waypoint, was just a minute away. Co-pilot La Guerrara made the call, trusting the instruments and his navigation. But something was off. Terribly off. He told the controllers they were almost over Curicó and asked for permission to descend. The controller granted it, unaware that the aircraft was still deep in the Andes, far from safety. For reasons no one fully understands, neither pilot noticed that the plane's navigation system showed they were still many miles away from their intended position. Normally, the flight from Planchon Pass to Curicó takes 11 minutes, but just 3 minutes later, they were descending, far too early. The plane, unaware of the lurking danger, began its drop from the clouds. Suddenly, the aircraft was slammed by violent turbulence. The rugby players, once laughing at the bumpy ride, grew silent as they peered out the windows. Something was wrong. The mountains, once distant, were now terrifyingly close, jagged, dark ridges rising up in front of them. One passenger, Nando Parado, remembered the moment vividly. That was probably the moment when the pilot saw the black ridge rising dead ahead, he told in an interview later. The plane dropped sharply, plunging through the clouds. And then in the clearing they saw it, rocky peaks looming too close for comfort. A wave of realization swept through the cabin. Roberto Canessa, another passenger, later reflected that the pilots had turned north too soon. They had begun their descent into Santiago, but they were still trapped in the Andes. In a desperate attempt to correct the mistake, the plane pulled upward, nearly vertical, but it was too late. The aircraft shuddered, on the verge of death. Alarms blared in the cockpit. The ground collision warning shrieked, filling the cabin with panic. Fear washed over the passengers as the reality set in. The mountains ahead were unforgiving, and the plane was moving toward them with no way out. In a desperate attempt to save the flight, the pilots pushed the engines to full power. The aircraft fought to climb, aiming to clear a ridge standing 13,800 feet high. But the mountains showed no mercy. Witnesses later said the plane struck the ridge not once, but 2 or 3 times. The co-pilot managed to lift the nose of the plane over the ridge, but at 3:34 p.m., the lower tail section clipped the rocky edge. In that split second, disaster struck. The impact tore off the plane's right wing, hurling it backward with such force that the tail cone was ripped from the fuselage. The rear section, along with 2 rows of seats, the galley, baggage hold, and stabilizers, broke away, leaving a gaping hole in the back. 5 people, 3 passengers, the navigator, and a flight attendant, were sucked out into the frozen air, lost instantly. The remaining engine kept the broken plane in the air for a few more moments, but not for long. Just ahead, a jagged rock outcropping rose to meet them. The left wing slammed into it, tearing free from the fuselage. Its propeller sliced through the plane's body, sending more debris, and 2 more passengers, tumbling out of the rear. The fuselage, now a mangled shell, crashed onto the snow-covered slope. It slid violently down the glacier, gaining speed, careening 2,400 feet at over 220 miles per hour. Inside, passengers clung to their seats, helpless as the plane hurtled toward its fate. The wreckage slammed into a snowbank, bringing the terrifying descent to a brutal end. The force of the impact sent seats flying forward, smashing them into the front wall of the cabin. The cockpit crumpled under the pressure, pinning both pilots against the instrument panel. Ferradas, the captain, was killed instantly. The investigation concluded that the crash was the result of pilot error. The plane, still under control, flew straight into the terrain, a tragic mistake. The wreckage came to rest in a remote, desolate place known as the Glacier of Tears. It lay at an elevation of 12,057 feet, deep within the Malargüe region of Argentina. This glacier sits between 2 towering giants, Mount Sosneado, nearly 17,000 feet tall, and the Tinguiririca volcano, rising over 14,000 feet. The location was far from civilization, right on the border between Chile and Argentina. The aircraft had strayed off course, coming to a stop 50 miles east of its intended path. Isolated by towering peaks and bitter cold, The survivors found themselves trapped in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. Later, two of the survivors climbed a 15,260-foot peak near the wreck. Nando Parado, one of them, named it Mount Hilaire, a tribute to his father. From there, they descended into Chile, searching for help and salvation. But the crash was only the beginning. What followed was one of the most terrible survival stories ever told. Of the 45 people on board, the tragedy began the moment the tail cone ripped away. 3 passengers and 2 crew members seated at the rear, Navigator Lieutenant Ramon Saúl Martinez, Steward Ovidio Ramirez, Gaston Costamale, Alexis Hunier, and Guido Magri, were thrown into the freezing sky and killed instantly. Seconds later, Daniel Shaw and Carlos Valeda also fell from the open rear. Shaw didn't survive the fall. Valeda landed deep in the snow, but as he tried to stumble through the glacier's icy surface, he suffocated. His body was not found until December 14th, 2 months after the crash. When the fuselage slammed into the snowbank, the seats tore loose, slamming the passengers forward. Team Doctor Francisco Nicola, his wife Esther, Eugenia Parado, and Fernando Vasquez were crushed to death on impact. In the cockpit, Captain Ferradas died instantly, his body pinned against the controls as the instrument panel crushed his chest and forced his head through the shattered windshield. Co-pilot La Guerrara was still alive but trapped, his body twisted in the cockpit wreckage. In frustration, he begged a passenger to find his pistol and end his suffering. But the survivors could not bring themselves to do it. La Guerrara died the following day. Only 33 people were left alive, many with severe injuries. Broken legs, shattered bones, some wounds too serious to treat. Arturo Noguera's legs were crushed beyond repair. None of the survivors with compound fractures survived. 2 medical students, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, began working urgently. They treated those who had the best chance of surviving. Nando Parado, unconscious from a skull fracture, lay in a fragile state for 3 days. Enrique Platero, with metal lodged deep in his abdomen, pulled it out himself, dragging out a piece of intestine with it, and without hesitation, joined the others to help. Within an hour of the flight vanishing, the Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was alerted. 4 aircraft were dispatched to scour the skies, following the plane's last known position along the Curicó corridor toward Santiago. As the sun set, news of the missing flight spread through Uruguayan media, raising hopes and fears among waiting families. But as the hours passed with no sight of the aircraft, rescue officials reviewed radio logs. Their conclusion was grim. The plane had likely crashed deep in one of the most isolated, unforgiving corners of the Andes. They turned to the Andes Rescue Group of Chile for help. Unknown to the search teams, the flight never made it across the border. It had gone down in Argentina, 21 kilometers from an abandoned hot springs resort, hidden from all eyes. On the second day, rescue efforts intensified. 11 planes from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay joined the search. The aircraft swept across the accident zone, and on several occasions, they flew directly over the wreckage. Inside the shattered fuselage, the survivors watched helplessly as rescue planes soared overhead, so close yet unaware of the life clinging to the snow below. Desperate, the survivors used lipstick salvaged from their luggage to write SOS on the roof of the fuselage. But the lipstick ran out before they could make the letters big enough. They piled luggage into the shape of a cross, hoping it would stand out against the endless snow. But it didn't. Each time a plane flew past without spotting them, hope slipped further away. The white fuselage blended perfectly into the frozen landscape, leaving them invisible from the skies. The harsh conditions tested both rescuers and hope. After 8 days with no sign of survivors, the mission was called off. On October 21st, after 142 hours of relentless searching, officials made a chilling announcement. No one could have survived. The search was over. They planned to return in December, when the snow would melt, and they could recover the bodies. But no one knew. The living were still waiting. Before we continue on, if you are enjoying the story so far, please remember to hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel. If you don't like it, let me know down in the comments. Your support truly means everything. Alright, back to the video. As darkness fell on the first night after the crash, the cold claimed 5 more lives. Among them were co-pilot Lagurara, Francisco Abal, Graciela Mariani, Felipe Maquirian, and Julio Martinez Lamas. The 28th who remained alive knew they had to act fast. They turned the wrecked fuselage into a crude shelter, barely large enough for them all. With luggage, broken seats, and snow, they sealed off the back of the plane, trying to keep the freezing air out. Vito Strauch, one of the survivors, crafted a way to collect water using scraps of metal from under the seats. He even made makeshift sunglasses from the plane's sun visors to protect against snow blindness. They used wool seat covers for warmth and the cushions for snowshoes. Marcelo Perez, captain of the rugby team, stepped up as their leader. He tried to keep spirits high, but the reality of their situation sank in. After 3 days, Nando Parrado woke from his injuries. The news he received was unbearable. His mother had died in the crash, and his sister Susana was severely injured. For 6 more days, he cared for her, but on the 9th day, she too passed away. With each night, temperatures plunged to a deadly -30 degrees. The survivors had lived their entire lives by the sea. For many, this was their first experience with snow, and none of them had any training to survive in such brutal high-altitude conditions. They were without medical supplies, cold weather gear, or even enough food. And there were only 3 pairs of sunglasses among them to prevent snow blindness from the endless glare of the sun on the snow. On the 11th day, they found a small transistor radio jammed between the wreckage. Roy Harley, one of the survivors, rigged a long antenna with electrical wire from the plane. As the static cleared, they heard a chilling announcement. The search for them had been called off. They were alone. In that moment, their despair deepened. The sound of weeping filled the cold fuselage. But one voice, calm and strong, broke through the sorrow. It was Gustavo Nikolic. He stepped forward, looked at his friends and said,
"Hey boys, there's some good news. They've called off the search."
The cabin fell silent in disbelief. "Why is that good news?" Paez demanded. Nikolic's reply was simple, but it carried a spark of hope.
"Because it means we're going to get out of here on our own."
The survivors had almost no food. They found 8 chocolate bars, a few small jars of jam, a tin of mussels, some candy, and bottles of wine. It lasted only a week. Nando Parrado stretched 1 chocolate-covered peanut over 3 days. Above the timberline, there was no vegetation, no animals. When the food was gone, they ate cotton from the seats and leather from shoes, which made them sick. The group knew the search had been called off. Rescue would never come. Faced with starvation, they gave each other permission. If one died, their body would become food. They resisted the thought at first, horrified. But hunger tightened its grip. They had no choice. Canessa, one of the survivors, later described their suffering. "Our bodies were eating themselves just to stay alive. We searched everywhere for food, but there was none. We knew the answer, but it was too terrifying. Our friends' bodies, frozen in the snow, were the only way to survive. But could we do it?" Canessa prayed, asking God for permission. Without it, he feared they would be stealing their friends' souls. They struggled with guilt and fear. Were they becoming savages? Or were they simply doing what was necessary to survive? The decision was made. Canessa set the example, cutting a piece of flesh with a shard of glass from the wreckage. He swallowed the first bite, a piece no larger than a matchstick. Slowly, others followed. Some refused at first, unable to accept the horror of what they had to do. Parrado protected his mother and sister's bodies from being eaten, but soon, hunger forced them to dry the meat in the sun to make it easier to consume. At first, they could only eat the skin and muscle, but in time they ate organs, hearts, lungs, even brains. They were all Roman Catholics. Some feared eternal damnation for eating human flesh. Others compared it to the Eucharist, where bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Some cited John 15:13. No greater love than this, to lay down one's life for a friend. Even those with strong faith struggled. Liliana Methol, the last female survivor, refused to eat at first. In the end, she agreed only after someone suggested it was like receiving Holy Communion. Near midnight on October 29th, 16 days after the crash, disaster struck again. An avalanche thundered down the mountain, crashing into the fuselage as the survivors slept. Snow and ice buried them alive, smothering 8 people in an instant: Enrique Platero, Liliana Methol, Marcelo Perez, and 5 others. Perez, the team captain, was their leader. Liliana had cared for the injured like a mother. Their loss left the survivors shattered. The avalanche packed the fuselage with snow, leaving only a meter of space near the ceiling. Panic set in. They realized they would run out of air. Nando Parado grabbed a metal pole and forced it through a windshield, breaking a hole to the surface for air. When morning came, they dug a tunnel through the snow and crawled out. But a raging blizzard drove them back inside. For 3 days, they were trapped in the snow-filled fuselage, surrounded by the dead. On the 3rd day, hunger forced them to eat the bodies of their friends. Parado later described the moment. The flesh was soft and greasy, streaked with blood and cartilage. I gagged as I tried to swallow. With Perez gone, new leaders emerged. Daniel Fernandez, Eduardo, and Fito Strauch took control. They divided the tasks, harvesting flesh from the dead and rationing it carefully. Even before the avalanche, some survivors knew escape was their only hope. The co-pilot had insisted the plane was near Curacao, making them believe Chile was just a few kilometers west. But they were wrong. They had crashed deep in the Andes. Chile was 89 kilometers away. As the snow began to melt with the arrival of summer, a decision was made. A few survivors would attempt the impossible: climb the mountains and find help. Canessa and Parado volunteered. They were joined by Vizintin, but Numa Turcati, weakened by an infected leg, had to stay behind. To prepare, the expedition team received extra rations of meat and the warmest clothes. They spent a week resting, waiting for temperatures to rise. On November 15th, the trio set out, heading east instead of west, hoping the valley would curve toward Chile. After hours of trekking, they stumbled upon the plane's tail section buried in snow. Inside, they found a treasure: chocolate, meat patties, rum, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, medicine, extra clothes, and the plane's batteries. They camped there that night, starting a fire to stay warm, reading comic books, and for a brief moment feeling almost human again. But the next day they were hit by brutal cold. On the 2nd night they nearly froze to death. Weak and disoriented, they decided to return to the tail section, hoping to power the plane's radio. If they could send an SOS to Santiago, rescue might still be possible. Reality crushed their hopes. The batteries were too heavy to carry back through deep snow. So they returned to the fuselage, planning to bring the radio to the tail instead. Roy Harley, an amateur electronics enthusiast, tried to connect it, but it was hopeless. The plane's radio required a power source the batteries couldn't provide. Days of effort ended in failure. Defeated, the group returned to the fuselage. They knew now there would be no rescue. If they wanted to survive, they would have to climb out of the mountains themselves. Another blizzard struck as they made their way back. Roy Harley, exhausted and hopeless, collapsed in the snow, ready to die. But Parado refused to leave him. He hauled Harley back to the fuselage, determined to keep him alive. On November 15th, Arturo Nogueira died from his infected wounds. 3 days later, Rafael Echevarren followed. Numa Turcati, weakened by hunger and unwilling to eat human flesh, deteriorated quickly. On December 11th, weighing just 25 kilograms or 55 pounds, he took his last breath. He was the final victim of the crash. The survivors knew time was running out. If they didn't leave soon, they would all meet the same fate. Then, faint hope stirred. Through the static on their transistor radio, they heard the Uruguayan Air Force had resumed the search. But they also knew waiting meant death. The only way out was over the mountains to the west, where Chile lay on the other side. But the climb would be deadly without a way to survive the freezing nights. The group decided to make a sleeping bag using insulation from the fuselage, wire, and waterproof fabric from the plane's air conditioning system. In his book Miracle in the Andes, Nando Parrado explained how they crafted it. They had to survive bitter nights without freezing. Daytime temperatures might rise above freezing, but the night could kill them. Their solution was to stitch the insulation patches into a quilt. By folding it and sewing the edges, they made a sleeping bag large enough for 3. If they could trap the heat from their bodies, they just might survive. Carlitos Paez, who had learned sewing from his mother, took charge. With needles and thread from a sewing kit found among the wreckage, he began stitching. Others joined in. Coche Inciarte, Gustavo Zerbino, and Fito Strauch proved the fastest. Before they could set out, Turcati's health gave out. He died just as the sleeping bag was completed. His death weighed heavily on Canessa, who was still unsure about making the journey. The group convinced Parrado to go, but no one volunteered to join him, except Canessa. With some convincing, Vizintin agreed to come too. On December 12th, the 3 men began their climb into the unforgiving mountains. The survivors believed they were at 2,100 meters, or roughly 6,900 feet, but the plane's broken altimeter was wrong. They were much higher, 3,664 meters, or roughly 12,000 feet. Misled by the co-pilot's last words, they thought they had flown past Curico, near the western edge of the Andes. Convinced that help was westward, they packed only 3 days' worth of food. Parrado wore layers, 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, a polo shirt, and 4 pairs of socks wrapped in a plastic bag. But they had no climbing gear, no compass, no map, and no experience. On December 12, 1972, Parrado, Canessa, and Vizintin set off into the mountains, aiming to escape the glacier. Instead of choosing a lower ridge to the south, they pushed straight up a dangerous 30 to 60-degree slope. They thought they'd reach the top in a day, but the climb quickly turned into a nightmare. Parrado led the way, with the others begging him to slow down. The thin air made every step a struggle. At times, the snow was so soft they sank up to their hips. Nights were brutal, but the improvised sleeping bag they made kept them alive. Canessa later described the first night as the worst of his life. A blizzard raged, and they had to settle on a narrow, rocky ledge at the edge of a cliff, barely level enough for the sleeping bag. From the crash site below, the others watched as the 3 men disappeared into the mountains. Days passed. By the 3rd day, Canessa was too exhausted to continue and stayed at their camp. Parrado and Vizintin pressed on, only to face a towering 100-meter, 330-foot ice wall. Parrado carved steps into the ice with a stick. When they reached the ridge at 4,503 meters, 14,774 feet, they expected to see green valleys below, but all they found were endless snow-capped peaks. Disheartened, they descended back to Canessa at sunset. That night, sipping from a small bottle of cognac they had found in the wreckage, Parrado whispered, "Roberto, can you imagine how beautiful this would be if we weren't walking dead?" It became clear the journey would take longer than they had planned. They decided Vizintin should return to camp, giving Parrado and Canessa a better chance of surviving with the remaining food. Using an aircraft seat as a sled, Vizintin slid back down to camp in less than an hour. The next morning, Parrado and Canessa climbed again, reaching the ridge after 3 grueling hours. Once more, all they could see was snow in every direction. Canessa muttered, "We're dead," Parrado said to him. "We may be walking to our deaths, but I'd rather meet it head-on than wait for it." Canessa nodded. "You and I are friends, Nando. We've made it this far. Let's go die together." But as they descended, Parrado noticed 2 peaks on the horizon free of snow. A winding valley stretched below them. He was certain it was the way out. Refusing to give in, they followed the ridge toward the valley. For 7 more days, they trekked deeper into the valley. The air grew warmer, and soon they reached the snow line. They began spotting signs of life, a discarded soup can, and then, on the 9th day, cows grazing in the distance. But Canessa was too weak to continue. They stopped to rest, gathering wood for a fire. Suddenly, across the river, they saw 3 men on horseback. Parado shouted for help, but the river's roar drowned his voice. One of the men saw them and shouted back, "Tomorrow." The next morning, the rider returned. Unable to cross the river, he scribbled a note, tied it to a rock, and hurled it across. Parado picked it up and read the message. "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. My friend is injured, and 14 others are still trapped in the wreckage. We have no food. We are too weak to keep walking. Please help us, where are we?" The man, a Chilean arriero named Sergio Catalan, read the note. Shocked, he signaled that he understood. He threw a loaf of bread across the river and promised to return with help. Catalan rode west for 10 hours, spreading word of the survivors. Along the way, he found another arriero and sent him toward the crash site. Catalan rode on, reaching the village of Puente Negro, where the authorities contacted the Chilean army. Meanwhile, Parado and Canessa, exhausted but alive, arrived at the village of Los Maitenes on horseback. Locals gave them food and shelter. Canessa had lost half his body weight since the crash. He weighed only 44 kilograms, or roughly 100 pounds. Parado and Canessa had climbed over 839 meters, or roughly 2,800 feet from the crash site to the ridge, then descended 1,425 meters, or 4,700 feet over 10 days. They traveled nearly 54 kilometers, or about 33 miles through the unforgiving terrain. The world was stunned when news broke that survivors had emerged from the wreck of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. Their 72-day struggle in the unforgiving Andes quickly became a global sensation. Reporters from across the world swarmed to Termas del Flaco, hiking kilometers from Puente Negro, desperate to hear Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa's story. Every detail of their fight for survival became front-page news. The Chilean Air Force deployed 3 helicopters to aid in the rescue. Thick clouds forced the pilots to rely only on instruments as they flew towards Los Maitenes, where Parado and Canessa shared what they had endured. When the skies finally cleared around noon, Parado guided the pilots toward the crash site using a map he had carried throughout his journey. The treacherous landscape stunned the rescuers. They couldn't believe how the 2 men had crossed it on foot. On December 22, 1972, the helicopters reached the crash site. But the terrain was too steep for a full landing. One skid barely touched the ground. The helicopters, struggling with thin air and weight limits, could only take half the survivors on the first flight. 4 rescuers volunteered to stay behind with the remaining survivors, spending one last freezing night together on the mountain. At dawn the next day, the helicopters returned. On December 23rd, the final survivors were pulled from the wreckage, more than 2 months after the crash. Exhausted and broken, the survivors were flown to hospitals in Santiago, where doctors treated them for severe malnutrition, frostbite, dehydration, broken bones, and altitude sickness. The dead remained behind, their recovery left for Argentine authorities to arrange. Before leaving, the Chilean rescuers photographed the crash site and carefully mapped the area. It would be some time before the fallen could be properly laid to rest. On their second day climbing, Canessa spotted a distant line in the valley to the east. He was certain it was a road and argued that they should head toward it. But Parado dismissed the idea. He thought it was too risky. They believed the crash site was already on Chilean soil, so they continued west instead. Later they learned that Canessa's road might have led them to safety much sooner. But Juan Ulloa, an experienced guide who later retraced their steps, believed they made the right call. He speculated that an eastern route would have been deadly. The path was riddled with cliffs and hidden dangers. Parado and Canessa had chosen the longer way, one that, against all odds, kept them alive. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, and want to see more, then check out these videos on the screen now. If you have a topic suggestion, please send it to the email in the description, and as always, remember to like, comment, share the video, and subscribe to our channel. And remember, the only thing scarier than this story is missing out on our next video.